Good evening, welcome. Thank you all for coming here to this last installment for the spring of 2012 of the Conversations with Great Leaders in memory of Preston Robert Tisch. This is a wonderful program for the Aspen Institute, and I want to start by thanking the members of the Tisch family who have underwritten it for us. It's Lori Tisch, who's here, and Jonathan and Lizzie Tisch and Steve Tisch, who aren't here tonight, but they started this program about 3 years ago in memory of their father, Bob Tisch, who was a great presence in New York, a philanthropist, a businessman, a model in a lot of areas. And over the years, we've tried to select leaders from all the walks of civic life that he cared so passionately about. And we've had maybe a dozen leaders at this point, and they're all pieces of Bob Tisch, so it's fascinating to sort of build all the pieces of this man who had such a wonderful consciousness for the city and the world around him. I also want to thank Hunter College. We have a partnership with Hunter that allows us to do regular and frequent events in this wonderful space, and we're very lucky to be here. We are trying to do more and more in New York City, and if any of you are interested in coming to more things than you already do, please stop at the front desk on your way out. We're especially doing more in the arts and architecture and design, and I want to recognize Damian Wetzel, who's our director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program. He was a former dancer with the New York City Ballet, and he's really ramping up his activities in New York, and he's going to be doing a lot, so you'll be hearing from us. I'm very proud tonight to present our featured speaker and our moderator, who are really distinguished voices in the world of American architecture and design. I won't go into too much detail because you have their bios in your program, but David Rockwell is someone who, if you have been in the past 20 years in a restaurant, hotel, terminal, Broadway show, if you've watched the Academy Awards, you have been immersed in the world of David Rockwell, and you're probably a happier person for it. He's at the intersection of architecture and performance, and we're lucky to have him. Paul Goldberger is probably the leading American voice in architecture and design criticism. Everyone knew his column at The New Yorker. He's now a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and he teaches and lectures around the country and the world on all things design and architecture, including historic preservation, so it's very fitting to have him here in this incredible historic house. Before we get started, Lori Tisch is going to come up and say just a few words, and then I think we have a short video before we start. Is that right? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. I have no prepared remarks, but I heard David and Paul say that they were going to wing it, so I thought that I would as well. First, I want to welcome everybody. I know some of you are here for the first time, some are repeat guests, and it's really a pleasure to see all of you. Thank you to Aspen. Aspen and Hunter. This has been such an incredible, this is the end of our second year, and has been such a phenomenal, incredible program, and I really can't think of a better way to honor my father, who both Paul and David knew. I see this room is filled with so many friends, which is why I did want to just say a few words. I see friends that I have worked with, friends that I have served on boards with. And speaking of friends, I met Paul Goldberger 28 years ago when our children were in pre-K together. And our kids went all through school together, even through college. And I don't think I've ever told Paul this, but I remember, I think you and Susan were talking about the window design at Rodo Shalom, not happily, in the TWOS program. And I looked over to say, wow, who knows so much about design? And I see the name Paul Goldberger, who at the time was a New York Times critic. And I thought, wait, I've been reading Paul Goldberger for years. But how could he be this young? I expected to see somebody twice your age. So anyway, it's been a wonderful 28 years of friendship, and I really appreciate your coming here. And David, I've known not as well as Paul, but through the years. This is our first time actually doing a project together, but I hope it will not be the last. I look forward to, well, you worked on the Meadowlands, right? Yes, the second time doing a project together, and I hope that there are many, many more. So thank you to my team at the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund, headed by Rick Lofglass, ably headed by Rick Lofglass, and Emily Grillo, my assistant, who is here. And again, thanks to everybody for their support and for really honoring my father in this very meaningful and special way.
Laurie, thank you very much. It is true, we have a long and wonderful friendship. We were honored also to be friends of your parents, and the diversity of everything that both of them represented, but particularly your dad, still stuns me when I think that sort of there is almost no area that we could get into that doesn't have a Bob Tisch connection in some way or another. But the one that I think everyone remembers most vividly is just the idea of pleasure, excitement, and enthusiasm about a physical place, particularly New York City, and all the sort of stimulus that came from it. And of course, those are also ideas that I connect very closely to David Rockwell, who, unlike any other architect I know, who publishes a monograph of his work, and every architect seems to publish a monograph of his work. Coffee tables would be bare if architects did not write about their work. David is the only one who's ever called his monograph Pleasure, a one-word title. And no, it is not a sex book. It is actually a book about architecture. And it tells you a great deal about where David is at. He is the only person I know who could get away with a title like that and still be taken seriously, which is a great achievement, I think. We're going to put off for a moment or two the video that was mentioned in the introduction, because I think it would be nicer to sort of talk briefly about David's thought process a little bit, and then we'll show you one interesting insight into it, a very atypical slice of architecture you'll see in 3 or 4 minutes. But David, what did you mean by calling your book Pleasure? Let's start with that. Okay.
Well, is it on? Can you hear me? Thank you for the introduction. And Bob was, is this on? Hello?
Yes.
Bob was an incredible influence in the city, and the story that comes to mind most to me is I still am on the board of Meals on Wheels, where he chaired, and on a lot of boards, but no one chaired a meeting like Bob Tisch. So you knew it was over in an hour, you knew it would be well organized, and you knew everyone in the room would have a voice. And it was quite extraordinary to be that included. The book Pleasure came out of, is this as glitchy as it sounds?
Yeah, it keeps going in and out. I'm going to give you a new one here, David.
This is not pleasurable, so we're
Yes, but what other institution operates with such efficiency that the
Yes,
moment you
it's
say
true.
something like that, magically an alternative appears, just like that? I mean, we have to be impressed with that.
So when we were putting together the monograph, one of the things I wanted to do that architects don't do is reveal the process.
Right.
And in fact, I felt like so much, I was recently looking at an incredible monograph of an architect I won't mention.
Okay.
And it had these huge pictures with sort of obscure poetry under each line. And you'd get through the book and have no idea what they were thinking or what the intent was.
Right, right. Let alone pictures of people.
No
Right,
people.
Right.
So I felt like it was an opportunity to, first of all, look not just at our work, but our studio's work. And over the last 26 years, we've worked with an awful lot of really interesting, smart collaborators, some of the Rockwell Group people, some of them craftsmen and artisan. And I recently was having lunch with a theater director who was talking about his impetus in theater and the importance of expressing pleasure. And so much of my interest in architecture grows out of early experiences in New York,
Right.
looking at these wonderful idiosyncratic spaces that brought people together. And so that's really what got me from an early age about architecture, was the ability to create environments or places that people celebrate in together. So pleasure became, for us, the operative word to look at the project, but then look at the influences that led to that result.
Right. No, that's a wonderful way, I think, to put it. You've always, I would say, you've operated at the intersection of architecture and the idea of the stage set in many ways, but I could go further and say you've almost created a new intersection between architecture and the idea of the stage set. And in so much of the history of modern architecture, those things were viewed as antithetical to each other, that you know, a stage set was indulgent and soft and fun, and architecture was serious and important and moral and right. How do you deal with the fact that those are realms that for so many people were considered untouchable, and yet you brought them into a point of intersection?
Well, it's something that's obsessed me from the time I was a college student. And so my undergraduate work at Syracuse University, where Werner Seligman, who was a staunch modernist.
Right.
And then
a very puritanical, a very brilliant but puritanical modernist, right?
Yeah,
And 'cause a lot
loved
of
the
modern
cigar and the
architecture-
whiskey, very Mies van der Rohe.
Right, right. A lot of that was sort of puritanical in a
Yeah.
certain way. Yeah.
And I always found myself asking the question of looking at buildings not just from the structure, but what was the inner life of that building?
Right.
And more interesting, what was the inner life of buildings that connected? What was the thing that moved people from place to place? So my earliest experience as a kid, my mom was involved in theater.
Right.
And we lived in a home right out of Waiting for Guffman with the lifeguard and all the local productions. And so I fell in love with theater. At age 12, we moved to Mexico suddenly, and that interest in theater became much more of an interest in public space.
Okay.
And it was at a time when there was incredible concrete structures going on, and you think about Guadalajara and the marketplace, and I was mesmerized by the sense of spectacle. So I was sent off to Syracuse, sort of branching between these two ideas and thinking about how they intersected. And for my thesis project, I did a study on Times Square, which was looked at very disapprovingly at Syracuse. And then I went to the Architectural Association in London, where anything is, the more outrageous, the better.
Right.
And fell in love with theater again. So I had moved away from theater, really embraced architecture, and then in London got more into the idea of theater, particularly sort of spontaneous theater.
Right.
Came back to New York, and it is a struggle as an architect, because I think even the word theatrical is pejorative in architecture.
In the minds of certainly classical architectural theorists, yes, it's right. You're not supposed to be having a good time. And
when I think of architecture as theatrical, I don't mean sequence and strobes, although there's nothing wrong with that for the right thing. What I mean is behaving theatrically.
Right.
I mean, I realize now, and I do think most architects, and I'd be interested to get your opinion on this, but I think most architects do what is in their sort of pure DNA, and then 20 or 30 years into it, turn it into a theory. But I think a lot of it is
yeah, there's a lot of backfilling of theory that goes on, absolutely. Yeah.
So I started to recognize that in all of the work I was doing, I was influenced by a day I came to New York when I was 12, before we would do Mexico. And my father took my family to Schraff's for lunch, which was my first New York restaurant experience.
Which you've been working on recreating ever since, right?
I've been trying to work that out in therapy and in my work. But dining for a kid on the Jersey Shore with four brothers, dining was a competitive art form.
Right.
And eating in this New York City restaurant, you could hear the people next to you, and it was a major experience. And then we went to the Imperial Theater to see Fiddler on the Roof, my first Broadway show. And I do think that those two experiences were very linked. And so what interested me was creating places that acknowledge there's an audience and there's a performance. And that's not just in theater. So there's so many rich elements you can abstract from theater. The sense of entrance.
Yes.
When you go into Radio City Music Hall, that sequence is as choreographed as any piece of theater.
Right. Anything that your own processional movement through it is as choreographed as anything that happens on the stage.
Correct.
In fact, yes. Right. Right. I was thinking. I went through a somewhat similar experience at college when I went to Yale, and I was excited by all those modern buildings by Louis Kahn and Paul Rudolph and all that. But then I discovered all these fake Gothic buildings that you were, of course, supposed to hate because they were stupid and indulgent and fake and inauthentic and all that stuff. And I thought they were absolutely wonderful. And how come I like these things so much if they're so bad? Right. And so it was that same coming to terms, I think, with the idea that it's okay for you to have an emotional connection to buildings. They're not just intellectual things. Yeah,
and some of the greatest buildings, I know you're working on a project with Frank Gehry,
right.
But you walk through Bilbao, and that's an emotional experience.
Absolutely, sure.
And in fact, I think part of the genius is capturing that emotional moment in structure.
Absolutely, totally.
I also think New York is fascinating because I think when people think about architecture in New York, they think about the sort of bird's eye,
right.
Cartesian grid, skyscraper city.
Right.
And I think the city I see is the messy, vital, door stoop, always changing city. And I think that, and now is, you know, as an architect, as you get older, you get bigger commissions, more mature commissions, and as we get bigger buildings to do,
right.
What I'm working on is holding on to that sense of spontaneity and movement and magic in bigger projects.
You're always very responsive, I think, to the idea of the street, really.
Yeah.
You're not, I mean, which is where, in a way, everybody is a performer in a certain way.
Right.
On that public stage of the street.
Yeah, in fact, I think when you walk around the city, someone here asked me tonight why all these restaurants are popping up around Madison Square. And we're working on the clock tower for Ian Schrager, which is a dream come true.
Going to be the hotel.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Amazing building, and a difficult building to put a hotel in because it's all core. So it forces interesting solutions. But I think the city morphs around public space.
Yes.
You know, I think the High Line has changed. It's an incredible thing, but the development around it's incredible too. The same in Times Square, and I think the same in Madison Park. So I think the street inspires so much of what makes a city, why you live in a city.
Right. And don't you think there's a new consciousness of public space today than there was, say, a generation ago in New York? Or a higher consciousness of it?
I think there's no question, and it's interesting to me because I think the book I did after Pleasure was called Spectacle,
right?
Which was perhaps a
I'm
more.
I'm glad it wasn't a book called Pain after Pleasure. Actually.
No, that's coming.
That's next. Okay.
Which was perhaps a more loaded word than pleasure.
Right.
And Spectacle grew out of actually a talk I gave at the TED conference. The first time I spoke there, the creator of TED advises you, speak about something you're an amateur at. Speak about something you love, don't promote your work. And Robin Wagner, who's one of my heroes and one of the great theater designers, I had gone to theater because I loved it. And I certainly had studied theater design. I had worked for Arthur Storch at Syracuse Stage when he was running that. When I was in London, I eveninged at the Mermaid Theater working for Bernard Miles, but I never thought about it as doing it for a living. And Spectacle grew out of a talk that I gave at TED looking at qualities of architecture that you can abstract and look at great pieces of theater that embrace those same ideas. Transformation, for instance, which in theater, it's the only art form I know where things change in front of you.
Right.
Although architecture is now starting to do that. Some of it breaks down a lot, but...
Right.
You mentioned a higher consciousness on public space. I think we spend more and more time dominated by small screens.
Right.
and yet we crave public space. And I think my observation
It may not be an accident that, in fact, we crave it because we spend so much time privately in front of small screens.
I think we want to belong to something bigger than ourselves. I think we want to participate. I think we want to feel that thrill of getting away from the tyranny of a small screen.
Right, and an online community is all well and good, but it is not the same as a real community. I mean, there's a reason we're not doing this from your office as a live stream video.
Right.
I mean, it has a different meaning being in this space with everybody together.
No question.
Right, right. Speaking of that, why don't we maybe actually look at that short video right now, which is connected to a project you did that is not a building at all, really, but something very different, but tells us a lot about your sensibility.
Meanwhile,
Right.
just to tee it up, what we're looking at is a play date of a project that we developed over the last 6 years called Imagination Playground. And I can describe afterwards, if you want,
Sure.
what led to doing this, which was really private-public partnership and post 9/11 New York.
Look, this thing is nice to lay on. Look. Hammer in hand. Look at this. I don't know what it is. We can do anything as long as we work together. Oh, I got an idea with this. You put it together, push it in. Do you need any more of these? Yeah. Okay. 5 more. Here you guys, more dominoes. We need a block with a hole. Where do you want me to put it? Noodle. Come on, Amir. We have to drive to Candyland. Hello, my name is Paris. I didn't get out. We have so much fun in this playground, and we can make stuff. We get to dream, and everything we dream will come true. It's important to have a lot of fun. When we use our imagination, anything can happen. Wow! It worked! Yeah! Yeah! It's a TV. See?
Okay, David, so talk to us about what we just saw.
So, right after 9/11, I got a phone call from one of the parents from PS 234. It's a school that had to move to 13th Street in Tribeca. They had to leave the premises, and the principal, who was an amazing woman named Anna Switzer, who's left since then, said, David, you know a lot about color, and can you help make this cafeteria less depressing for these kids because they're going to be relocated? And we were about to open a huge project in Connecticut, and I went to look at the school, and we actually volunteered 40 of our people, and everyone we asked wanted to participate. Myra Kalman, who's the Play With Your Food guy, Jos Van Elfers, Tom Otternes. And it was this incredible urban barn raising, and we transformed this school in 2 weeks. It was a very powerful experience, and I was then approached by someone within the city who saw it, asking if we could create a VIP viewing platform at 9/11. And this was the moment in time where every architect was going out in the evening and having dinner parties and speculating about what should be rebuilt. And I thought that was not only idiotic, but I thought it was offensive to be speculating when, in fact, as someone who lived in Tribeca, you couldn't even observe what had happened. so people were planning the rebuilding before you could have an observation. So I went down, this is about 3 weeks after 9/11, and got a tour. And the family viewing platform was a very simple plywood piece where people had left messages. And my response was, I won't do a private viewing platform, but I will do a public viewing platform. This was about 110 days before the end of the Giuliani administration. And they said, that's fine, but it needs to be privately funded. So within 110 days, I brought in Kevin Kennan and Liz Diller and Rick Scofidio. Charles Renfro wasn't a partner yet. And we raised about $1 million and built the viewing platform that existed at 9/11 on Liberty Street. And it was incredible. It was just this extraordinary, and you know, as someone who loved the city, I really didn't understand the way private-public partnership could be such a powerful experience for us. After that was complete, several of the people who had given us money said, you want to do another project downtown? We'd like to continue the foundation. So I had an idea with Kevin called the Incubator that we spent about a year working on. It was going to be visual and performing arts, new work, and we had a great group of people. And after a year, a lobbyist who the city provided said, this is never going to happen. You have to get the federal government to approve, LMDC. I had meetings with LMDC. They didn't know who Arthur Miller was. It was not positive. And in a moment of total frustration, I said to someone who works with me, passing Pier 25, there was a place called J Street Pier that had been taken out of circulation. We should have just given the city a playground. So he said, well, what would that look like? And I had been thinking about it because I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. We play in a lot of playgrounds. There's a lot of great-looking playgrounds. But what they wanted to do was make up their own rules. They wanted to create spaces themselves. And I remember I came home and I had ordered them an art table, and I wanted to see how it was being used. And they were in the hall in the box with the foam pellets, and they were having so much fun in the box. And I thought, well, maybe the container is more fun than the equipment. And so we, that began this process.
You are not the first parent to have observed that, I think, actually, but you're right. So, and that led to the playground, basically.
Well, that led to me calling Adrian Benepe, who is and was extraordinary, as is, I think, the entire administration. I've got to say that it's unbelievable what's happened to this city in this administration. And Adrian came to see me right away, and like every architect, I had hundreds of sketches of great playground equipment. And ultimately, I said, what is the simplest common denominator that would allow kids the most flexibility? And I started to think about block play, which is, of course, very much something many architects have looked at. And I thought, what about scaling that up so they're social? And then I came across the post-World War II playgrounds outside of London, the Imagination Playgrounds, which were about process. So we designed a permanent playground in Lower Manhattan called Imagination Playground. A year before that opened, we did a test play date just with the blocks with these portable crates. And there are 500 portable playgrounds around the world being used now, including a bunch that are being deployed in third world countries because it gets play where it's needed immediately. So
it needs no real infrastructure, in effect, right?
And no instruction. Those kids were given.
Right.
And the kids do much more imaginative things than the grown-up architects in our office, I've got to say.
Great, great. Let's talk for a moment about some of the more, well, let's put it this way. I mean, in the playground, you've taken what has been a fairly conventional form and reinvented it, reconceived it in a way. I think by not just coming up with a different solution, but by knowing to ask a different question in the first place. I think that it's not just a different answer, it's that you thought to ask a different question. How have you asked different questions in projects? I mean, one thing that you've done recently that I very much like, and it's nice to see George and Eleanor Monroe here, is the Eleanor Bunin Monroe Film Center at Lincoln Center Film Society. How did you ask different questions there that yielded that result, let's say?
Well, that was one of those very, very rare, wonderful instances where we were approached before Film Society had picked the real estate. And they were looking at real estate in and around Lincoln Center. They were looking at acquiring buildings. And there was this little piece of space off 65th Street that was unbelievably challenged. It was like the little train that could, because it had a lot of frontage. But in order to get the ceiling height to get a screening room in, and to get acoustical isolation, you had to excavate underneath the main plant of Lincoln Center.
It's basically tucked under the plaza and over the garage, sort of, right?
Well, it actually, it is what was office space for the Met.
Right.
It's where Joe Volpe used to reign supreme. And we looked at the space and said, this would be a fantastic...
And where many opera singers then are probably buried. It's
terrifying.
Yes, right.
So we started to work with Film Society, and one of the things that I realized is, and again, as I said, I think architects have the 2 or 3 ideas they're most obsessed with, and my question was, in addition to just seeing the film, what else do you want to have happen here?
Right.
Well, they wanted to have a community around film. People who love film want to talk about film, and they wanted to be able to program in a way they can't do at the Walter Reed because it's too big, so it creates a little bit more risk in terms of putting smaller, edgier films. When we started to study the possibility, we were fortunate to be working within the master plan that DSR had set up, which basically tries to return 65th Street to being a series of non-traditional marquees. Our marquee at Film Society is a cantilevered box office that from Broadway you actually see the box office. And then we kept looking at how far we had to get people to travel to get to the screening room. And the aha moment was when we asked the question, can we start to look at how you might program this over a year?
Okay.
And I think it goes to a critical question for architects, and that is, how do you not have more hardware than software? Particularly in a performing arts center. So I was at Yale a few weeks ago as a critic for Geary's studio, where they were doing opera houses.
Yes.
And he went out of his way to make sure the students were informed about performance. But architects are inclined towards hardware. And so as we looked at the programming, we realized we could take that depth and actually create a screening room that in fact was the lobby. So since we had to tear down anyway, we created something that's called I believe it's still called the amphitheater, right? Is that and it's about a 75-seat tiered lobby. So during the day, you can get a bite to eat and sit there. They can program director shorts, commercials, and in the evening there's a big garage door as a kind of unconscious homage to the garage roots of the place that can close it off. So the real question was, Film Society, I also think that we realized in most New Yorkers' mind, Film Society is the film festival.
Right.
But in fact, they're the most prolific programmers at Lincoln Center. So they're certainly the most accessible. So by putting the box office so it catches people and then creating this kind of orange path that leads you into the amphitheater that is public and can become private, we were able to create something that moves Film Society forward.
Right. Yes, let's start with you. Just wait a moment for the microphone. There it is.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all your comments. I've dined at many of your restaurants and been at theaters, so it's great to see you. Questions. You talked about so many of things that you've done well. I'd be fascinated to hear about something that you were disappointed in and why you were disappointed and how you did it. I think you learn as much from mistakes as you learn from your victories.
I think that's true, although you're less public about those.
Not now, you're not going to be.
Well, I'll give 2 examples. The first is in the early 90s, there were an awful lot of big restaurants in 18th, 19th Street, which we did 2 very big ones, and they were sort of our first big breaks. One was called Cafe Roma, which is where Murray's is now. A bakery. What's the bakery place called? Murray's the owner. City Bakery. It's in the space where City Bakery is. And one was 2020 for Ashford and Simpson, which was a project. You know, so many of the projects I've done felt like life or death. And I think that's part of the creative process, that, you know, you just feel like you have your career riding on getting it exactly right. In 2020 was something I lavished a huge amount of attention on. And it just didn't work. People didn't come. And then Ashford and Simpson, and Nick Simpson recently died. I don't know, you know, they were two Motown legends. They decided, since it wasn't working as a restaurant, they were going to make it a cabaret. So for 300 people, you had Joe Cocker, Nina Simone, incredible, incredible stuff. So that was heartbreaking for me. And the way I found out it was closing was a contractor called me and asked me, how do you rip out these slabs? So that was a little harsh. And then there's projects where you have a different story in your head. And there's, you know, there's projects. I did a project called Free Man of Color at Lincoln Center that I loved. I loved John Guare. I loved working in the Beaumont. And I loved George Wolfe. And the play was not well received. And that is, you know, and there's no amount of great props that's going to change that. So, you know, there's examples. And also, I think my basic theory about what we do is a lot of what we do is meant to be permanent. But in some ways, I think there's an inverse relationship between the impact something has and its ephemerality. And I think that's part of the impact of theater. So if you believe that, when something is ripped out or changed, you have to be able to accept that, because not all things are meant to be there forever, even though Paul will tell you every architect has a kind of God complex that way.
Well, they do, but on the other hand, part of the power, say, of Christo and Jean-Claude's work has always been that it was temporary, and that gave it a kind of intense power. If the gates were going to be in Central Park forever, it wouldn't have had the emotional impact that it did.
When we did the Academy Awards the first time, we convinced the Academy, after working with Bill Condon on it, to rip out 650 seats in the theater we had designed 12 years ago and replace those with new seats that radially made the audience part of the performance. And that was the closest relationship of terror and thrilling, because literally the night before I thought it was the end of the world. I thought the show was unbelievably dull, and then the Academy was concerned with stars like sitting in the new seats. And then it turned out to be this thrilling, incredible triumph.
You're lucky you had a client that would trust you, though, that much, I would say.
Well, what they really did was they put total trust in the producer. Mm-hmm. And so the producer has all the rope they need to do whatever they want to do.
Another question. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I wonder whether... Wait for the mic. First, thank you so much for this. I always wonder about the influence in terms of how what you do in your work or what you've seen by influences has changed policy. Policy meaning when art makes people not just say I like it or I hate it, but I have to change the way I move, think, or even have governments literally change policy. What are the most intense examples you've seen of that, either in your work or in the influences?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think it's a cause and effect thing, but the work in playgrounds, what we discovered is one of the things that keeps all playgrounds behaving the same, even if they look different. So it can look like a ship or a fire engine or whatever it looks like, is that the equipment itself, the legality and the risk aversion of any new equipment and everything that's required for legal reasons is so intense that there's not a lot of variety. So by making it portable and demountable and more in the form of a landscape, we found we could get around a lot of that. And I remember playing with my kids in Central Park, and it was the Victorian Gardens amusement park thing that's set up in the women's skating rink, which was very controlled and lots of safety controls. And right outside, what my kids wanted to do was climb the dangerous rock cliff. And so I think we've been part of an interesting dialogue about that. I also think that there's a huge interest in restaurants right now. I think dining has become a kind of obsession. And one of the things I've always believed in is restaurants are not really an investment opportunity. If there's not someone at home, if there's not like someone really who's running the shop, I think it's a mom and pop business at heart. And I think we've continued to be a part of that.
You know, I think architecture and design at the end of the day, they reflect the culture and what the culture wants, and then help push it forward more than completely change the culture. You know, I did this book a couple years ago called Why Architecture Matters, in which I was obviously trying to say it matters, or I wouldn't have written it, but I was also trying to say, you know, let's not be confused and think that architecture and design cure cancer, or you know, cure hunger, or are justice in the courtroom, or bread on the table, and so forth. I mean, it's important to remember that they create ways to make a sustained life better, as opposed to sustain a life that might not otherwise be sustained.
And one of the biggest terms in architecture is critique, right? You look at it as a kind of critical point of view. And I think is architecture, you do get to critique. And I think just living in the city over the last 10 or 12 years and seeing the transformation in the livability of the city, the public space, the emphasis on green space is...
And I think your work responds to all those things, and then in turn reinforces them and pushes them forward still more. In fact, it's a dynamic relationship between the architecture and the social and political forces that exist. I think we probably have time for one more if there is one. Yes, sir, back there.
So David, you said that one of the things you said is that kids did more imaginative things with the blocks than the grown-up architects thought to do. And that sort of got me thinking, how do you think about sort of education and design and sort of the mix between how much of it is technician versus artist?
Well, that's a very complicated answer. And you know, there's, I think, and Paul might have something to say about that as well, I think different schools embrace very different points of view. And we have a lot of interns. We have a very robust intern program. And I meet with the interns a couple of times as a group, and we talk about what they're doing. A lot of them are high school students who have gotten scholarships to get internships. I think you know, the trick is to not live totally in the theory world, because you need some skills. And there's the great Malcolm Gladwell, is it 10,000 hours or 100,000 hours, whatever, how many hours you're supposed to practice something. I think part of it is just looking at a problem enough times. And I think what students need to be encouraged to do is not lose their idiosyncrasies. I think schools do tend to rub off idiosyncrasies and try and turn out people who are consistently one way. And I think the real great gift in my life has been I found a way to incorporate very peculiar idiosyncrasies into a career.
I think that's right. And I think you found a way to incorporate enthusiasm, among other things, actually, into a career. You know, you may need 10,000 hours or whatever to develop expertise, but the greater challenge is how, after 10,000 hours, you can still approach something with freshness, with fresh eyes, and not with a sense of rote operation. I think that's the hardest thing, I think, as an adult in any profession, not just architecture and design.
And I think one way to do that is to take projects where you specifically don't know the answer before you begin. I think that sense of discovery and creativity and risk-taking is harder as you've done more things, but I think it's absolutely essential.
That's a wonderful note on which to end. David, thank you very much for doing this. Thank you.
And thank you. you, Paul, so much for doing that. That was really great. Thanks to both of you, and thank you so much to our audience for being here. I can just add, I hope I'm not jumping the gun and announcing this just to this intimate group, but in the fall we will be, I think it seems like a fitting way to end tonight, we'll be giving the 2012 Preston Robert Tisch Award in Civic Leadership to Danny Meyer, who's a wonderful model of a lot of the things that we've talked about. So. Lori's looking surprised. But I hope you'll all join us for that in November 2012. So thank you very much for coming.
It's a multiple unit. It's an interesting thing.